In the early 20th century, as the Ottoman Empire crumbled and Europe plunged into the chaos of World War I, a single letter changed the course of history in the Middle East. Penned in 1917 by British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour, it appeared simple on the surface, a declaration of support for a Jewish homeland in Palestine. But beneath its polished diplomatic language lay the seeds of one of the most complex and enduring conflicts of our time. Welcome to our channel, where we explore history's turning points, one story at a time. If you are passionate about understanding the untold layers of our past, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. Now, let us go back to that pivotal moment in 1917. The Balfour Declaration was just 67 words long, but its impact would echo across generations. It read, "His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object." But the sentence did not end there. It added a crucial caveat, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. At first glance, the statement seemed to balance competing interests, supporting Jewish aspirations while protecting Arab communities already living on the land. But the reality proved far more turbulent. To Zionist leaders, the declaration was a breakthrough, a long-awaited validation of their dreams. To the Arab inhabitants of Palestine, it was a harbinger of betrayal, especially considering that Britain had also made vague promises of Arab independence during the war, including through the Hussein McMahon correspondence. And if that was not complicated enough, the secret Sykes-Picot Agreement between Britain and France had already carved up the Middle East into spheres of influence behind closed doors. What followed was not just a political puzzle, but a demographic and emotional earthquake. Jewish immigration surged, land ownership began to shift, and mistrust hardened into identity. The seeds of today's Israeli-Palestinian conflict were quietly but decisively planted. This video is not about choosing sides. It is about peeling back the layers of promises, politics, and people whose lives were shaped by a few carefully chosen words on a piece of paper more than a century ago. Stick with us as we travel through the twists and turns of modern Middle Eastern history, from declarations and wars to peace deals and uprisings. Because sometimes, to understand the present, you have to begin with the fine print of the past. As the First World War raged across continents and empires teetered on the brink of collapse, diplomats in smoke-filled rooms thousands of miles from the Middle East were quietly drawing lines on map lines that would shape destinies for generations to come. While soldiers fought in trenches and civilians endured unimaginable hardship, a very different battle was unfolding behind closed doors. One of promises made, alliances forged, and futures exchanged like bargaining chips. In this world of secret diplomacy, the Sykes-Picot Agreement emerged as a silent architect of a troubled future. Signed in 1916, the Sykes-Picot Agreement was a covert pact between Britain and France, two of the most powerful colonial forces of the time. The plan was straightforward on paper. Divide the lands of the defeated Ottoman Empire into zones of influence. Under this arrangement, France would control what is now modern-day Syria and Lebanon, while Britain would take charge of areas including Iraq and what would later become Palestine. The agreement was never intended for public eyes, especially not for the Arab leaders who had been led to believe they would gain independence in exchange for their support against the Ottomans. While this secret deal was being inked in Europe, British officials were simultaneously engaging in another diplomatic dialogue, a correspondence with Sharif Hussein of Mecca, a prominent Arab leader. Through the Hussein McMahon letters, the British suggested that they would support the creation of an independent Arab kingdom if the Arabs revolted against Ottoman rule. These promises were not vague expressions of goodwill. They were deliberate and strategic, meant to secure Arab cooperation in a war that Britain could not afford to fight alone on so many fronts. And then, Just a year later came the Balfour Declaration, a letter to the Zionist movement, expressing Britain's support for a Jewish homeland in Palestine, so long as the rights of the existing non-Jewish communities were preserved. To the outside world, each of these commitments may have seemed like separate pieces of diplomacy, but to those living in the region, Palestinians, Arabs, and Jews alike, these promises did not exist in isolation. They overlapped, conflicted, and ultimately laid the groundwork for deep mistrust. From the Arab perspective, the revelation of the Sykes-Picot Agreement felt like a betrayal. It was not just a breach of diplomatic etiquette. It was a breaking of trust at the most fundamental level. The very land that they had been told would form the basis of their independent nation was already being promised to foreign powers. The ink on their hoped-for future had barely dried before it was rendered meaningless. The situation was further complicated by the Balfour Declaration, which did not occur in a vacuum. When it was issued in 1917, it was layered atop these earlier contradictions. While Zionist leaders saw it as a historic turning point, a moment when a homeland seemed within reach, Arab leaders viewed it as yet another broken promise, another decision made without their input, concerning a land they had called home for centuries. What made these contradictions so powerful was not just their political weight, but their emotional resonance. This was not merely about lines on maps or policy documents. It was about identity, belonging, and the right to shape one's own future. To many Arabs in Palestine, the influx of Jewish immigrants, encouraged by both Zionist leaders and British policy, felt like a shifting tide they were powerless to control. And for many Jews fleeing persecution in Europe, the land of Palestine was not just a safe haven, it was a historical and spiritual return. Caught between imperial strategies and idealistic visions were ordinary people, farmers, shopkeepers, religious leaders, and families, who suddenly found themselves part of a larger game, their futures negotiated without their voices. What had been an intricate but diverse society was increasingly polarized, and the fabric of shared life began to fray. The Sykes-Picot Agreement, once secret, was eventually made public by the Bolsheviks after the Russian Revolution, and its disclosure sent shockwaves through the Arab world. It confirmed the worst fears of Arab nationalists that the promises of independence had been little more than tactical moves in a broader imperial game. Trust, once broken at this scale, is difficult to rebuild, and in this case, it set the stage for a century marked by suspicion, resistance, and recurring cycles of conflict. Meanwhile, Britain attempted to navigate its dual commitments, supporting Zionist aspirations on one hand, and trying to placate Arab unrest on the other. But the contradictions were too great. As Jewish immigration increased, so did Arab resistance. Protests turned into riots, and the British found themselves caught in a conflict of their own making. Their efforts to mediate, including white papers and commissions, often ended up pleasing no one. This period, marked by overlapping promises, secret agreements, and rising tensions, was more than just a prelude to later wars. It was the crucible in which modern identities were forged. Jewish hopes for a homeland, Arab demands for self-determination, and imperial ambitions collided with a force that still echoes today. Understanding this history does not require assigning blame to one side or another. Rather, it calls for an acknowledgement of how a web of diplomatic maneuvers, each seemingly logical within its own context, could collectively produce outcomes that no one fully anticipated. The people of Palestine, whether Arab or Jewish, inherited a landscape already charged with conflicting expectations. And as we will see in the next chapters of this story, those expectations would soon explode into open conflict, drawing in regional powers and leaving an indelible mark on the world. Stay with us as we unravel the next chapters in this journey, chapters marked by wars, displacement, and fragile hopes for peace. And if you are finding value in this exploration of history's most complex crossroads, please consider subscribing, giving this video a like, and sharing it with others who care about understanding the roots of today's world through the lens of the past. By the end of World War II, the world stood at a crossroads, still reeling from unspeakable devastation, yet desperate to rebuild. In Europe, the horrors of the Holocaust had laid bare the depths of human cruelty, and for many Jewish survivors, the notion of returning to ancestral lands in Palestine was no longer just a dream. It was a matter of survival, of restoration. Across the Mediterranean, however, in towns and villages scattered throughout Palestine, Arab families who had lived on that land for generations were watching with growing unease as migration surged and tensions thickened. What began as a simmering discontent was soon to erupt into something far more permanent, irreversible, and painful. Amid these growing tensions, the newly established United Nations sought to intervene, attempting, perhaps naively, to solve a century of layered complexities with the stroke of a pen. On November 29, 1947, the UN General Assembly passed Resolution 181, better known as the Partition Plan. It proposed a division of British Mandate Palestine into two separate states, one Jewish, one Arab, with an international regime to govern Jerusalem. The vote passed by a narrow margin, and in halls around the world, it was hailed as a diplomatic victory. But on the ground in Palestine, it felt like a seismic rupture. The partition plan awarded 55% of the land to the proposed Jewish state, even though Jews made up only about one-third of the population and owned less than 10% of the land at the time. For Zionist leaders, it was an imperfect but crucial step towards statehood. But for the Arab Palestinians, many of whom had deep roots in the land going back centuries, it was viewed as an unjust and imposed solution, one that ignored their rights, aspirations, and historical presence. In their eyes, a homeland was being carved up and handed over without their consent. Violence erupted almost immediately. What had once been simmering unease between communities transformed into street-level conflict, then into full-blown civil war. Attacks, counterattacks, and retaliations spiraled as communities that had lived side by side found themselves on opposite ends of an unfolding tragedy. By May 14, 1948, the day the British Mandate officially ended, and David Ben-Gurion declared the creation of the State of Israel full-scale war was inevitable. Within hours of Israel's declaration, armies from Egypt, Transjordan, now Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq launched a military intervention, marking the start of the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. What unfolded was not merely a battle between armies, but a profound reordering of land, identity, and memory. Villages were overrun or destroyed, neighborhoods emptied, and families forced to flee in the chaos of gunfire and advancing troops. Roads that once connected towns became escape routes, and ancient olive groves became sites of frantic departures. For Palestinians, this event became known as the Nakba Arabic for catastrophe. It was not just the loss of land, but the disintegration of a way of life. More than 700,000 Palestinians fled or were expelled from their homes, ending up in refugee camps in neighboring countries, often with little more than the clothes they wore. Entire communities vanished, erased from the maps and the memories of official records, though never from the hearts of those who had once called them home. To many Israelis, the war was one of independence and survival. It was a moment when, after centuries of persecution, they finally had a nation of their own. The emotions of victory were real joy, relief, pride, but so too were the complex consequences that followed. The triumph of one people had come at the cost of another's displacement, and the competing narratives of 1948 became foundational myths, one of rebirth, the other of rupture. The new state of Israel quickly took shape, its infrastructure expanding, and new immigrants arriving in waves from war-torn Europe and the Middle East. But just beyond its borders, in dusty refugee camps and temporary shelters, a parallel reality unfolded. Displaced Palestinians waited with hope, anger, and memory, believing that one day they would return to the homes they had been forced to leave, the fields they had tilled, the keys they still kept, the deeds they carried, All became powerful symbols of a future they refused to abandon. Meanwhile, ceasefires were negotiated, armistice lines were drawn, and maps were redrawn not by natural geography, but by the boundaries of conflict and diplomacy. The borders that emerged from the 1948 war were never internationally recognized as permanent. They were marked not by agreement, but by exhaustion. And they carried with them the weight of unresolved grief on both sides. International actors looked on, some hopeful, some indifferent. The United Nations set up relief organizations, but global attention soon shifted elsewhere to Cold War rivalries and emerging new powers. The Arab world, humiliated by military defeat, became increasingly radicalized in its rhetoric, while inside the borders of the new state of Israel, a generation grew up with the constant tension of living surrounded by states that refused to recognize its existence. The legacy of 1948 continues to echo into the present, not as a single event, but as a dividing line in collective memory. For Israelis, it remains a moment of national triumph forged under fire. For Palestinians, it is a wound that never fully closed. And between the two, the space for mutual recognition remains fragile, caught between competing histories, both shaped by genuine suffering. This chapter of history is not just about war and territory. It is about how narratives are built, how memory is passed down, and how the past continues to shape the present. The Nakba is remembered not only in dusty archives, but in family stories, preserved keys, and old photographs hidden in suitcases. And for every Independence Day celebration, there is a refugee family still hoping for return, still asking the question, what happens when your home becomes someone else's homeland? As we move deeper into the story of this conflict, these dual realities of joy and grief, victory and loss, continue to coexist, unresolved. And understanding both is essential if we are ever to grasp the full complexity of one of the most enduring and emotional disputes in modern history. By the summer of 1967, the Middle East had become a powder keg. The wounds of 1948 were still fresh, and in the years that followed, tension had only deepened. Refugees from the Nakba still lived in camps across Jordan, Lebanon, Gaza, and the West Bank. Their stories passed from parent to child like sacred heirlooms. In Israel, surrounded by hostile neighbors and haunted by its fragile legitimacy, the sense of existential threat had never faded. Along borders that were never truly settled, skirmishes and military buildups became part of daily life. Then, almost overnight, the world changed. On the morning of June 5, 1967, as the sun rose over the Sinai Desert, Israeli jets screamed into the sky and launched a surprise attack on Egyptian airbases. Within hours, most of Egypt's air force lay in ruins, caught on the ground before it could even take flight. This bold, preemptive strike marked the opening of what would become known as the Six-Day War, a brief but transformational conflict that would redraw not only maps, but also the emotional and political landscape of the region. In military terms, it was a stunning success for Israel. Within 6 days, it had seized control of the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt, the Golan Heights from Syria, and most symbolically, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem from Jordan. The old city of Jerusalem, with its sacred stones and centuries of contested devotion, came under Israeli control for the first time since 1948. The moment was electrifying for many Israelis. Soldiers wept at the Western Wall. Secular and religious citizens alike felt history folding in on itself, as if prophecy had collided with politics. But for Palestinians, the Six-Day War deepened an already painful saga of loss. The occupation of the West Bank and Gaza meant that hundreds of thousands more now lived under Israeli military control. Roads were blockaded, villages were placed under curfew, and families once again found themselves uprooted. For those who had fled in 1948, now living in places like Ramallah or Jenin, it felt like history had doubled back, repeating its harshest verses. The term occupation became part of everyday vocabulary, not just in political discourse, but in school lessons, family dinners, and whispered prayers. The war also shattered illusions of Arab military dominance. The armies of Egypt, Jordan, and Syria had suffered quick and humiliating defeats, despite months of rhetoric promising the liberation of Palestine. In capitals from Cairo to Damascus, there was a reckoning not just of military strategy, but of identity, pride, and purpose. Arab nationalism, which had surged under charismatic leaders like Egypt's Gamal Abdel Nasser, now faced its most serious crisis. The defeat was not just on the battlefield, it was psychological, generational. Internationally, the aftermath of the war created ripple effects far beyond the region. The image of Israel shifted dramatically. Once seen as a vulnerable young state fighting for survival, it was now viewed as a regional power, agile, strategic, and capable of reshaping the balance of forces in the Middle East within days. Its military prowess won admiration from some, concern from others. And in the United Nations and foreign ministries around the world, the urgent question became, what now? The territories captured during the war were never intended by many to be held permanently. In fact, the United Nations quickly passed Resolution 242, calling for Israel's withdrawal from territories occupied in the recent conflict, in exchange for recognition and peace. Yet the ambiguity of that language, from territories, not from all territories, would spark decades of legal and political debate. Israel began establishing settlements in the newly occupied areas, actions it saw as strategic and historical, but which Palestinians viewed as expansion and entrenchment. In the years that followed, the land itself became more than just contested terrain. It was a canvas of overlapping claims and irreconcilable memories. A hill outside Jerusalem might be seen as a sacred inheritance by one group and a site of dispossession by another. Checkpoints, barbed wire, and military patrols became part of the landscape, as did defiance, resistance, and longing. For every house built, another was lost. For every flag raised, another was torn down. And for those who lived within the shifting borders, daily life became a negotiation of identity and survival. The emotional resonance of the Six-Day War cannot be overstated. For many Israelis, it was proof that their existence would no longer depend on the approval of others, that the ghosts of exile and vulnerability could be banished by strength. But for Palestinians, it was a turning point that cemented a new phase of their struggle, one not just for return, but for dignity under occupation, for a voice in a system where decisions were increasingly made without them. The Six-Day War may have lasted less than a week, but its consequences have stretched across decades. It hardened positions, complicated diplomacy, and transformed local grievances into global issues. It changed what peace would mean, and for many, what justice would require. The world watched as history accelerated in the heat of the Middle Eastern sun, and as leaders tried to explain, control, or capitalize on the events, those on the ground simply tried to understand how everything had changed so fast. The war became a defining moment, not only in military textbooks or political speeches, but in the way generations on both sides would understand their past and shape their future. It drew a line not just across territory, but across hearts, dividing memory from myth and hope from heartbreak. And as we move forward in this story, deeper into occupation, resistance, negotiation, and fragmentation, we carry with us the echoes of those 6 fateful days, days that did not end a war, but instead began a new chapter in one of history's most enduring struggles. In the early hours of October 6, 1973, silence fell across Israel. It was Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the Jewish calendar, a time of fasting, prayer, and quiet reflection. Streets were empty, radios were silent, and synagogues were filled with worshippers wrapped in white. But just across the borders, in Egyptian and Syrian military headquarters, the final stages of an operation were unfolding, an operation that would shake the Middle East to its core and leave a legacy of both pride and pain that echoes to this day. Without warning, Egyptian forces stormed across the Suez Canal, while Syrian tanks rolled into the Golan Heights. The assault was swift and coordinated, a well-planned strike aimed at reclaiming territories lost to Israel in the Six-Day War just 6 years earlier. For Egypt and Syria, this was more than just a military campaign. It was a declaration of resilience, a bid for dignity after the humiliation of 1967. And for Israel, it was a shocking reminder that even its strongest positions could be vulnerable when complacency set in. Caught off guard, Israeli forces scrambled to mobilize. In the Sinai, Egyptian troops used water cannons to breach the sand embankments lining the canal known as the Bar-Lev Line, and established a stronghold on the eastern bank. Meanwhile, in the north, Syrian units surged across the Golan Heights, initially overwhelming the sparse Israeli defenses. For the first time in years, the Israeli public faced the unthinkable, the possibility that their nation, which had grown used to military dominance, might not be invincible. The early days of the war were marked by intense fighting, marked not just by the power of weapons, but by the weight of history. Every inch of ground gained or lost carried emotional weight. For Egypt, President Anwar Sadat framed the crossing of the Suez Canal as a symbolic victory, declaring, "We have erased the shame." The moment galvanized the Arab world, reigniting a sense of unity and purpose that had been fractured after 1967. Mosques across Cairo echoed with prayers, and the Arab street, long accustomed to disappointment, felt a surge of confidence and vindication. In Israel, the shock was total. The country's famed intelligence services had failed to predict the scale or timing of the assault. Confidence was shaken, and fear rippled through a society that had never expected to face war again so soon. But from within that vulnerability rose a fierce response. Within days, Israeli counterattacks began pushing Syrian forces back on the Golan Heights. In the south, a bold maneuver, led by General Ariel Sharon, breached Egyptian lines and crossed into Africa, encircling Egypt's Third Army. The tide was turning, but the cost was heavy. The Yom Kippur War, as it came to be known in Israel, or the October War, as remembered across the Arab world, would last just under 3 weeks. But its psychological impact would stretch much further. For the first time since 1948, Arab armies had achieved strategic surprises and meaningful battlefield gains. And while Israel ultimately regained its footing, it did so with a sobering realization: it was not invulnerable. The belief that military superiority alone could guarantee peace was shaken, replaced by a more complex understanding of power, diplomacy, and the need for dialogue. As the battlefield quieted, another front emerged. One fought not with tanks or fighter jets, but with briefcases, plane tickets, and carefully chosen words. U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger embarked on what became known as shuttle diplomacy, flying back and forth between capitals, forging ceasefire agreements, and laying the groundwork for a new phase of peace efforts. His efforts led to disengagement agreements between Israel and both Egypt and Syria, setting the stage for a diplomatic thaw. But beneath the handshakes and signatures, new realities were forming. For Egypt, the war had been a partial victory, a military demonstration that restored its honor and gave Sadat the political space to pursue negotiations. That path would eventually lead to the Camp David Accords, and Egypt becoming the first Arab state to formally recognize Israel. For Syria, the losses remained bitter, and the Golan Heights would stay under Israeli control, becoming one of the most contested areas in the region. Within Israel, the war triggered a wave of introspection. Public confidence in the government and military leadership eroded. Protests broke out, demanding accountability for the failures that had allowed the surprise attack to happen. Golda Meir, Israel's prime minister at the time, would eventually resign under pressure. The war reshaped Israeli politics, ushering in a new generation of leaders and a deeper sense of national vulnerability. For Palestinians, the war was both distant and personal. While they were not direct participants in the battlefield, the outcomes would influence their own trajectory. The shifting alliances, the rise of diplomacy over military confrontation, and the growing realization that a separate Palestinian identity could no longer be sidelined, all these developments gained momentum in the war's aftermath. It was becoming clear that any future resolution would require addressing not just borders and armies, but also the rights and recognition of a stateless people. The Yom Kippur War was not a definitive victory for either side. It did not resolve the deeper issues at the heart of the Arab-Israeli conflict, but it did change the emotional landscape. It proved that no power is immune to surprise, and that even bitter enemies might find common ground not through force alone, but through necessity, humility, and a recognition of shared humanity. As we look back, the lessons of 1973 still resonate. The war was a reminder that history moves in cycles, that pride and pain are often intertwined, and that the path to peace is rarely straight. It showed us that redemption, when sought through war, comes with a price, and that sometimes in the ashes of conflict, the seeds of diplomacy begin to take root. From the ruins of the Yom Kippur War came a fragile hope, a glimpse that, even after decades of bloodshed, nations could change direction, not through total victory, but through the courage to face vulnerability and the wisdom to imagine something different. In the summer of 1976, as much of the world enjoyed the slow hum of July days, a crisis unfolded that would once again place the Israeli story of survival and resilience onto the global stage. But this time, the battlefield was not the Sinai Desert or the Golan Heights. It was thousands of kilometers away, deep in the heart of Africa, at Entebbe Airport in Uganda. What began as a hijacking soon became a test of nerves, strategy, and the very limits of what a nation might do to protect its people. It started with Air France Flight 139, departing from Tel Aviv and bound for Paris, with a layover in Athens. On board were 248 passengers, including Israelis, Europeans, and crew. Shortly after takeoff from Athens, the aircraft was hijacked by 4 individuals, 2 from the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and 2 Germans affiliated with the left-wing radical group. They diverted the plane southward, eventually landing in Entebbe, Uganda, where the country's authoritarian leader, Idi Amin, welcomed the hijackers with open arms and offered them refuge. Once on the ground, the hijackers separated the Israeli and Jewish passengers from the others, releasing most of the non-Israeli hostages. The message was chillingly clear. This was a targeted act, aimed not just at Israel, but at the very identity of its people. They demanded the release of dozens of Palestinian and pro-Palestinian prisoners from Israeli and European jails, or they would begin executing hostages within days. As international observers watched with horror and hesitation, the clock began ticking. Back in Israel, the mood was one of collective dread, but also of determination. The trauma of the Holocaust, the wars of 48, 67, and 73, and the ethos of never again all converged into a singular resolve. This would not be another tragedy remembered in silence. This time, Israel would act swiftly, decisively, and far from home. What followed was one of the most audacious rescue missions in modern history, Operation Thunderbolt. Later renamed Operation Entebbe. Under intense secrecy, Israeli intelligence services pieced together the layout of the Ugandan terminal, relying on aerial photographs, blueprints, and even testimonies from Israeli engineers who had helped build the airport years earlier. Commandos rehearsed in full-scale replicas of the terminal, preparing for every possible scenario. The distance was formidable, over 2,500 miles, and the odds of success were razor-thin. On the night of July 3rd, a team of Israeli commandos boarded 4 Hercules C-130 transport planes and flew low across African skies to avoid radar detection. Their arrival at Entebbe, just past midnight on July 4th, was as daring as it was deceptive. The first vehicle to roll out of the plane was a black Mercedes made to resemble Idi Amin's personal car, flanked by Land Rovers to complete the disguise. The assault unfolded with lightning speed. Within minutes, the Israeli forces stormed the terminal, killing all the hijackers and securing the hostages. In total, 102 of the 106 remaining hostages were rescued. 3 hostages died in the crossfire, and 1 was later killed by Ugandan forces in a hospital. The price for Israel was 1 fallen commander, Yonatan Netanyahu, the older brother of future Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. His death added a deeply personal and symbolic layer to the operation's legacy. The mission stunned the world not just for its success, but for its boldness. It became a defining moment in Israeli history, a symbol of military prowess, intelligence coordination, and moral resolve. For a nation often described in terms of its trauma and defensive posture, Entebbe was a narrative of assertive heroism, a moment when distance and danger were no deterrents in the face of injustice. The operation also sent a message far beyond military circles. It reasserted Israel's commitment to protecting its citizens, wherever they might be. For Jews around the world, many of whom had family, friends, or memories of displacement, it was a reassurance that they were no longer alone. For Israeli society, still grappling with post-Yom Kippur war trauma and political instability, it was a moment of restored confidence. But not all reactions were celebratory. Idi Amin condemned the raid as a violation of Ugandan sovereignty and took brutal retaliatory actions against Kenyan nationals and others suspected of complicity. Internationally, while many praised the efficiency of the mission, others raised concerns about precedent, about nations crossing borders to conduct military operations without host nation approval. The line between justified action and dangerous autonomy became the subject of debate in diplomatic corridors and media headlines. Still, for the people of Israel, the significance of Entebbe went beyond strategy and geopolitics. It was about identity. It was about saying that even after centuries of persecution and diaspora, the Jewish people now had a home that would act, not just mourn, not just remember, but act. It was a moment that pulled together history and modernity, trauma and triumph, pain and pride. Entebbe became more than a rescue. It became a parable, passed down in classrooms and commemorated on anniversary stages. The Black Mercedes, the fallen commander, the midnight assault all took on a mythic quality, standing as a reminder of what a small nation surrounded by danger could do when united by purpose and urgency. In the broader story of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and regional turmoil, Entebbe stands apart. It was not about borders or settlements, not about occupation or displacement. It was about life and death in the most immediate sense, about hostages held in a far-off land and a daring decision to bring them home. And while it did not end any war or solve any peace process, it offered a glimpse of something rare, clarity in a conflict so often shrouded in gray. As our story continues, moving once more into the complexities of intifadas, negotiations, and shifting alliances, the Entebbe raid remains a pause, a flash of certainty, a moment where action spoke louder than words, and where the reach of a determined people knew no borders. In the summer of 1982, as the Mediterranean sun cast long shadows over the battered skyline of Beirut, another chapter in the Middle East's unending tragedy began to unfold. The Israeli tanks that had once stormed through the sands of Sinai now rolled into Lebanon, its lush valleys and crowded cities, about to become the next front in a conflict that had already spilled across decades and borders. But this time, the war was not only about lines on a map or the recognition of a state. It was about fractured societies, foreign interventions, and the rise of new forces that would alter the region's trajectory for generations. For years, southern Lebanon had been a haven for the Palestinian Liberation Organization PLO, whose fighters launched cross-border attacks into northern Israel. Villages in the Galilee region were frequently hit by rocket fire, and Israeli civilians lived under a cloud of fear. In retaliation, Israel conducted airstrikes and raids. But nothing seemed to fully stop the cycle. Then came June 3, 1982, when a Palestinian splinter group attempted to assassinate Israel's ambassador to the UK. Though the PLO denied involvement, Israel saw an opportunity to act decisively. The next day, Israeli forces launched Operation Peace for Galilee, with the stated goal of pushing the PLO back 40 kilometers from the border. But what followed far exceeded that boundary. Within days, Israeli troops had advanced deep into Lebanon. What began as a limited operation quickly expanded into a full-scale invasion, with Israeli units pushing all the way to Beirut. The Lebanese capital, already fractured from years of civil war, soon found itself encircled. The siege of Beirut became the centerpiece of the campaign. Israeli jets roared overhead, dropping bombs on PLO positions embedded in densely populated neighborhoods. Artillery pounded the city from the hills above, and in the midst of it all, civilians struggled to survive, huddling in basements, clutching loved ones, praying the next explosion would not be their last. The international community watched with growing alarm. Images of Beirut under bombardment flooded television screens worldwide. Condemnations poured in. U.S. diplomats scrambled to broker a ceasefire. After weeks of destruction, a deal was reached. The PLO would evacuate its fighters from Beirut under the protection of international forces. Yasser Arafat, the emblematic leader of the Palestinian movement, boarded a ship to Tunisia, his departure marking the end of an era. But the price had been enormous. Thousands of Lebanese civilians dead or wounded, a city in ruins, and the seeds of new conflict sown deep into the soil. What happened next would leave a scar not only on Lebanon, but on Israel as well. In the aftermath of the PLO's departure, a massacre unfolded in the Palestinian refugee camps of Sabra and Shatila. Over the course of 2 days, hundreds, possibly thousands of civilians were killed by a Lebanese Christian militia allied with Israel. Israeli forces stationed nearby did not intervene. News of the massacre sparked outrage across the globe and led to massive protests within Israel itself. In Tel Aviv, 400,000 demonstrators flooded the streets, an extraordinary display of public anger in a country still grappling with the trauma of war. For the Israeli public, the war in Lebanon became a source of deep national introspection. Unlike the swift victories of 1967, or even the hard-fought redemption of 1973, this campaign felt morally ambiguous, open-ended, and deeply costly. The initial aim to protect Israeli citizens had become entangled in a web of sectarian violence, foreign occupation, and political misjudgment. Lebanon was not a battlefield where lines were clearly drawn. It was a fractured nation, already suffering from civil strife, into which Israel had inserted itself only to find no easy way out. But while Israel would eventually withdraw from much of Lebanon, the consequences of its actions would linger far longer. In the chaos of occupation and resistance, a new force began to rise quietly at first. In the poor, predominantly Shiite neighborhoods of southern Lebanon and the Bekaa Valley, it called itself Hezbollah, or the Party of God. Funded and trained by Iran, it offered food, schools, and medical care alongside a fierce resistance to the Israeli presence. For many Lebanese Shiites, long marginalized by other factions, Hezbollah offered dignity, defense, and purpose. Hezbollah quickly grew from a guerrilla movement into a major political and military force. Its fighters targeted Israeli troops with ambushes and roadside bombs, making the occupation increasingly costly. Its ideology was deeply anti-Zionist, but unlike the PLO, it fused religious fervor with local community organizing. And while Israel had hoped to remove the threat on its northern border, it had inadvertently created a more resilient and deeply rooted adversary. In many ways, the 1982 Lebanon War marked a turning point not just for Israel, but for the entire region. It expanded the scope of the Israeli-Arab conflict beyond the traditional Palestinian context and into a broader, more fragmented geopolitical struggle. It accelerated the regional influence of Iran. It exposed the limitations of military power in asymmetric warfare, and it introduced Hezbollah as a long-term actor on the stage. a movement that would one day play decisive roles in Lebanese politics, Syrian conflicts, and future wars with Israel itself. Back in Israel, the legacy of the war left deep scars. Generals who had once enjoyed national hero status found themselves facing public criticism and political backlash. Parents mourned sons lost in a war that many no longer understood. Trust in leadership frayed. And yet, for all the grief and controversy, the war also became a moment of democratic awakening. The protests, the inquiries, the public soul-searching. They reflected a society wrestling not just with enemies at its gates, but with questions of morality, purpose, and identity. The invasion of Lebanon was not just a military campaign, it was a mirror. It showed the dangers of overreach, the complexities of intervention, and the unpredictable consequences of war. It was a reminder that even with the best of intentions, or the most urgent of justifications, violence rarely ends where planners expect. And in the silence that followed the bombs and the speeches, a new reality settled across the region, one in which power would no longer be measured only in tanks and jets, but also in networks, ideology, and the endurance of those who fight from the shadows. It began not with speeches or armies, but with stones. In December 1987, in the crowded refugee camps and sun-scorched streets of Gaza and the West Bank, a spark of resistance caught fire. A military truck collided with a civilian car in Gaza's Jabalia refugee camp, killing 4 Palestinians. The incident was not the first of its kind, but it landed like a hammer on a population already living under the weight of occupation, curfews, and uncertainty. The grief turned into rage, and that rage turned into something larger, a movement, a cry, a wave of defiance that would soon be known around the world as the First Intifada. The term intifada means shaking off, and for many Palestinians, that is exactly what it felt like. After 2 decades under Israeli control following the 1967 war, the people of the occupied territories had grown up in a world of checkpoints, military patrols, settlement expansions, and restricted freedoms. Their frustrations were layered political disenfranchisement, economic hardship, and the slow erosion of identity, but the uprising was not orchestrated from above. It was grassroots, organic, and relentless. It began with teenagers throwing rocks at armored vehicles and quickly escalated into mass protests, commercial strikes, and civil disobedience. Graffiti became a form of communication. Leaflets handed out in mosques or marketplaces spread instructions and slogans. Schools closed as students took to the streets. Women organized underground networks for aid and education. For many, it was not just a protest, it was a declaration of presence, a collective refusal to disappear. But resistance was met with force. The Israeli military, caught off guard by the scale and spontaneity of the uprising, responded with what it called the Iron Fist policy. Curfews blanketed towns for weeks at a time. Thousands were arrested, many without trial. Homes were demolished in reprisal attacks. Live ammunition was used to disperse crowds, and in some cases, soldiers were given controversial orders to break the bones of demonstrators using batons. These acts, some caught on camera by foreign journalists, shocked the global conscience. International perception began to shift. While previous conflicts were often framed through the lens of geopolitical strategy or state-to-state warfare, the First Intifada presented a starker image, a civilian population rising against an occupying power. The footage of young boys facing off against tanks, of mothers weeping as their homes were reduced to rubble, reached living rooms across Europe, America, and the broader Arab world. Sympathy grew not just for the suffering, but for the cause behind it. World leaders began to re-examine their positions. Western governments, which had long focused on security guarantees for Israel, started to acknowledge Palestinian national aspirations more openly. Even within Israel, the Intifada sparked fierce debate. Some saw the uprising as a threat to be crushed. Others, including prominent former military leaders, warned that a prolonged occupation would corrode Israel's moral foundations and global standing. Meanwhile, the Palestinian leadership, especially the Palestine Liberation Organization (PLO), saw in the uprising both an opportunity and a challenge. For years, the PLO had operated from exile, with bases in Tunisia and scattered Arab capitals. But now, the political center of gravity was shifting back to the territories themselves. A new generation of local leaders, not bound by old strategies, began asserting influence. Islamists, too particularly Hamas, which emerged in 1988, entered the fray, providing social services while embracing armed resistance, setting the stage for future internal divisions. The Intifada was not without its tragedies. Over 1,000 Palestinians were killed, many of them minors. Hundreds of Israelis also died, some in stabbings, shootings, or during riots. The uprising took a toll on both societies, fueling anger, grief, and fear, and yet, amidst the violence and suffering, something shifted. The question of Palestine, once dismissed as a thorny sidebar in Middle East diplomacy, could no longer be ignored. The world had seen too much. By the early 1990s, after 6 years of near-daily confrontation, cracks began to appear in the hard lines of policy. Back channels opened. Secret negotiations were held far from cameras and headlines. Eventually, these quiet talks would lead to the Oslo Accords, the first direct agreement between Israel and the PLO. The path there was long and uncertain, and Oslo itself would bring new hopes and disappointments, but it was the Intifada that forced both sides to the table. It had shifted the conversation from one of security alone to one of justice, recognition, and rights. The legacy of the First Intifada remains complicated. For Palestinians, it is remembered as a time of unity and courage, when entire communities stood up together with nothing but conviction and bare hands. For Israelis, it prompted a painful reckoning with the costs of occupation and the limits of force. And for the broader world, it marked a turning point, a moment when an invisible people became visible, when the struggle for statehood gained emotional resonance and moral urgency. The uprising did not end the conflict. But it did something else, something vital. It changed the narrative. It moved hearts and shifted policies. It proved that resistance could take many forms, and that even under the weight of overwhelming power, voices could still rise, and stories could still be told. As our journey continues through the tangled history of this conflict, the First Intifada stands as a raw, human chapter 1, written not by politicians or generals, but by the hands of ordinary people refusing to vanish from their own land. It was an image few thought they would ever see. On the south lawn of the White House in September 1993, under the bright glare of international cameras, two lifelong enemies extended their hands in an awkward but historic gesture. Yitzhak Rabin, the grizzled Israeli prime minister, and Yasser Arafat, the emblem of Palestinian resistance for decades, shook hands before a watching world. Standing between them was U.S. President Bill Clinton, smiling like a schoolteacher watching two students finally settle their feud. That moment, frozen in time, symbolized something almost unthinkable: mutual recognition between Israel and the Palestine Liberation Organization. The road to that handshake had been paved in secrecy. While the world focused on familiar rounds of diplomatic deadlock, a quiet dialogue was unfolding far from the headlines in Norway, of all places. Norwegian facilitators, operating with discretion and urgency, had brought representatives from both sides together in a farmhouse outside Oslo. Their months of intense negotiation transformed whispered hopes into signed principles. Israel would recognize the PLO as the legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, and the PLO would recognize Israel's right to exist and renounce terrorism. The resulting agreement, known as the Oslo Accords, was a leap into the unknown. For decades, Palestinians had lived under occupation without autonomy, and Israelis had lived under the constant specter of attacks and existential fear. Oslo promised a new framework. A phased plan would see the gradual transfer of control over parts of the West Bank and Gaza Strip to a newly created Palestinian Authority. Elections would follow. Security cooperation would begin. And most importantly, both sides would negotiate a final peace deal within 5 years, one that would tackle the thorniest issues still unresolved. For a brief time, there was something in the air that had not been there for generations: hope. Israeli and Palestinian flags were displayed side by side in some cities. International aid flowed into the Palestinian territories to support institution building and economic revival. Streets were renamed. Diplomatic channels widened. Tourists returned. Children in Tel Aviv and Ramallah learned new words like peace process and coexistence. The bloodied pages of history, it seemed, had a chance to be rewritten with dialogue instead of destruction. But hope, while powerful, is also fragile. The Oslo framework, while ambitious, was also deeply ambiguous. It left key issues deliberately vague to allow negotiations to move forward. But those omissions would later return like ghosts, haunting every diplomatic corridor. Chief among them were the fate of Jerusalem, the status of Palestinian refugees, and the future of Israeli settlements in the West Bank. Jerusalem was perhaps the most emotional and explosive. Both Israelis and Palestinians claimed the city, its stone-soaked in history, religion, and symbolism, as their capital. But under Oslo, its final status was postponed. East Jerusalem, captured by Israel in 1967 and later annexed, remained a focal point of Palestinian grievance and Israeli insistence. Then came the refugee question. More than 4 million Palestinians, many descendants of those displaced in 1948, still lived in camps across Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, and the Palestinian territories. The Oslo Accords acknowledged their plight but offered no immediate solution. Would they return? Would they be compensated? Would host countries absorb them? The answers, crucial to any lasting peace, were left to future talks that never fully materialized. And then there were the settlements. At the time of Oslo's signing, roughly 100,000 Israelis lived in settlements in the West Bank and Gaza. These communities, built on contested land, were seen by Palestinians as encroachments, and by many Israelis as legitimate expressions of historical and religious connection. Oslo did not stop their expansion. In fact, over the next decade, settlement populations would nearly double, casting a long shadow over the viability of a contiguous Palestinian state. As the years passed, optimism dimmed. The interim agreements that followed Oslo II, the Hebron Protocol, the Wye River Memorandum, added layers of complexity but failed to deliver the transformative change people had envisioned. Mutual trust eroded. Each act of violence, be it a bus bombing in Jerusalem or a military raid in Gaza, fueled political backlash. Extremists on both sides, who had opposed compromise from the start, gained ground. The promise of Oslo was also marred by personal tragedies. In 1995, Yitzhak Rabin, the man who had dared to make peace, was assassinated by a Jewish extremist in Tel Aviv. His death shocked the nation and the world, and robbed the process of one of its few leaders capable of bridging the abyss. Arafat, too, would find himself increasingly isolated, his authority challenged by rival factions and his credibility eroded by unfulfilled promises. Yet for all its failures and disappointments, the Oslo Accords remain a pivotal moment, a rare instance when both Israelis and Palestinians stepped back from the brink and reached for something better. It showed that recognition was possible, that dialogue could replace diktats, and that even entrenched enemies could envision a shared future. But vision without follow-through is not enough. The legacy of Oslo is now contested. To some, it represents a missed opportunity, a moment when peace was within reach but squandered by bad faith and political cowardice. To others, it was flawed from the start, built on uneven terms and vague language that merely delayed deeper conflicts. Still, that image of Rabin and Arafat shaking hands in Washington endures. It reminds us that even in a region defined by cycles of violence and betrayal, there have been moments when the horizon briefly widened, and two peoples who had spent decades in opposition dared to imagine something different. As our story continues, that moment lingers like a question. If peace was once possible, could it be again? And what would it take, not just in signatures or speeches, but in trust, justice, and vision, to make that fragile hope endure? The final chapters of our story are not wrapped in ribbons of resolution, but scattered across years of shattered hopes, deepened divisions, and haunting questions that remain unanswered. After the fleeting promise of the Oslo Accords, the landscape once again darkened. The early 2000s witnessed a resurgence of violence that shattered whatever trust had been painstakingly built. The Second Intifada erupted in September 2000, ignited by Ariel Sharon's controversial visit to the Temple Mount, an act that many Palestinians viewed as a deliberate provocation. What followed was a brutal wave of suicide bombings, military incursions, and a staggering loss of civilian life on both sides. The peace process, once buoyed by mutual recognition, collapsed under the weight of bloodshed and political intransigence. Negotiations stalled, and by the time the dust settled, the momentum had shifted. Israel had built a separation barrier known to some as a security fence, to others as an apartheid wall physically dividing communities, cutting off livelihoods, and symbolizing the deep mistrust that now defined the relationship. Extremism began to rise from the ashes of disappointment. In the absence of progress, voices once marginalized grew louder and more influential. In Israel, political tides moved steadily to the right, with successive governments viewing territorial compromise not as a pathway to peace, but as a potential security risk. In the Palestinian territories, the schism between Fatah and Hamas deepened, splitting Gaza from the West Bank and creating a fractured leadership unable to unify around a common vision. At the heart of this spiral lay a truth that few dared to fully confront, that the status quo had become the new normal. Israeli settlements expanded steadily throughout the West Bank, increasing from roughly 100,000 settlers in the early 1990s to over 700,000 today, including those in East Jerusalem. Entire hilltops were transformed into towns, with roads, schools, and security infrastructure reinforcing a permanent presence. For Palestinians, this territorial reality increasingly narrowed the possibility of a viable, contiguous state. And yet, amid the stagnation, life continues. Children are still born in Ramallah and Haifa, in Gaza and Tel Aviv. They go to school, dream of futures far from checkpoints and rocket sirens. But they also inherit the narratives of fear, mistrust, and trauma. The next generation grows up surrounded by walls, both physical and psychological, that teach them who is safe, who is dangerous, who belongs, and who does not. The world, too, has changed. Global attention shifts quickly now. New crises emerge. New conflicts dominate headlines. But the Israeli-Palestinian conflict endures, sometimes raging, sometimes simmering, but always unresolved. International efforts to mediate have ebbed and flowed, with plans proposed and discarded, summits organized and then forgotten. The fatigue is palpable, yet the stakes remain painfully real. Because this is not just a political conflict, it is a human one. It is about families forced from homes, histories rewritten or erased, daily indignities suffered quietly and loudly. It is about identity and belonging, about religion and memory, about who gets to walk free and who must show papers. It is about two peoples who each carry wounds and who still, somehow, must find a way to live on the same land. So where do we go from here? Perhaps the better question is, where do we choose to go? Because peace is not inevitable, but neither is endless war. It is a choice, a long and arduous one, built not on declarations, but on consistent, courageous steps. It begins with education, with understanding history in all its complexity, not to assign blame, but to foster empathy. It grows through justice, through equal rights, through the dismantling of systems that perpetuate inequality. And it flourishes only when leaders on both sides are willing to see the humanity in the other and act, not for headlines, but for healing. As we close this chapter of our story, Let us not forget the lessons we have learned along the way. The story of Israel and Palestine is not just about ancient lands or sacred sites. It is about people, about choices, and about the future we wish to create. If this video brought you new insight, if it helped you understand a little more clearly the tangled history of this conflict, we invite you to support our journey by liking this video and subscribing to our channel. Your support allows us to continue creating thoughtful, respectful, and nuanced content that sheds light on the stories that matter most. Thank you for spending this time with us. Wherever you are in the world, we wish you peace in your heart, clarity in your mind, and compassion in your words. And for now, good night.